So look, what I might do rather than talk about myself is actually, Laura, if you don't mind, for the listeners, explaining a little bit about the working arrangements that we have with FEFO Consulting and Skout Solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So we at Skout have engaged FEFO as a third-party contractor to conduct our WPSAs, which are workplace safety assessments on all the sites that we present staff out to, essentially contractors out to. So that will assess all of our blue collar sites and the roles against those, provide what am I looking for here? They will provide action plans, and they will provide us with information as to what could be done to better improve the site access that we can provide to our employees before they go out to sites, so that we can also give them the best opportunity at being safe out on site. So we rely heavily on their expertise to come in and say, okay, this is what we've established on the site. These are the processes that they have in place. And this is what you need to take into consideration prior to sending somebody out to site. So we can communicate that with our clients, and we can also communicate that with our employees. FEFO will also come in and help us do some investigations. I mean, as you're probably aware, when you have a great number of people out on site, things will happen. There'll be a lot of hazards that come through, and we can then engage the conversation to work collaboratively with FEFO and say, hey, how can we investigate this, and what are some options that we've got moving forward? So it's been really helpful when we don't have that much access to safety knowledge and that sort of thing, to be able to rely on the expertise in the business there.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, Laura. And look, in the context of today, talking around contractor management and mobilising contractors safely, I thought it'd be really useful to have Laura on board. Laura has a huge amount of experience in getting contractors and employees ready for site, and labour hire is a bit of a unique arrangement for many in terms of the nature of different contractors and stakeholders involved, and mobilising staff is absolutely critical in the game of labour hire. So in terms of a little bit more additional context around contractor management, look, today's really around the mobilisation, which is really only one part of a typical contractor management process and life cycle of various contractors, depending on the nature of the work that's being conducted. On the screen is just a typical dashboard of assurance activity that we provide to some organisations around their contractor management systems. For those that did miss last week, just a really quick recap. We spoke about some of the challenges around contractor management within industry. We spoke a little bit around how to segment and differentiate between contractors rather than having a one-size-fits-all, with the view of trying to really keep things simple and take a risk-based approach. We also spoke around various selection and engagement processes at the very front end when engaging contractors up front. So in terms of the next steps around mobilisation, today we'll also talk around a few challenges. In particular, we'll talk around this concept around compliance versus culture and where to really focus. From a personal point of view, when it comes to contractor management and mobilisation of contractors, there's only a certain amount of process that you can put in place, and we really overinvest in trying to create really strong leadership behaviours and inspire contractors when they come on site to work in an effective way. There's a great opportunity when people first start to really set the tone from the top and set the right tone to get organisations and contractors working in an effective manner. We'll also talk a little bit around our safety leadership results, particularly as it relates to contractor management and the impact that can potentially have on contractors. Having Laura on board, I'm sure we'll hear a few stories around labour hire, both good and not so good. And we'll talk a bit about process in terms of trying to get contractors ready prior to them starting work. So to kickstart, just so we can get a better feel for what the audience is trying to understand today and what their interests are, out of those topics that we're going to be talking about, it'd be really good to get a feel from everyone on the call today around what's their area of interest, and then we can hopefully tailor some of the messages and time accordingly. We've only got the 30 minutes, so it's pretty short and sharp, so we want to try and make sure that we provide as much as we can, much value as we can for our listeners.
Yeah, I find that safety people like to talk about safety. It can go on, can't it?
We'll just give it a few more seconds to get everyone involved in the poll.
So the options being compliance versus culture, leadership behaviours, some stories around labour hire, and contractor readiness prior to work starting.
Okay.
Alrighty, so we've got a pretty good balance there. It's your lucky day, Laura. We won't be relying on you too much to talk around too many stories around labour hire. There is some interest, of course.
I can always follow up, that's fine.
Around 4% interest there in labour hire stories, but that's okay. No doubt you can contribute to many other areas that we're talking about today as well. We've also got a neck and neck result there around compliance versus culture, and contractor readiness coming in around the 30 or 40% mark, and leadership behaviours 20%. So that gives us a really good indication. So thank you. So given the interest around compliance versus culture, I mean, some of these, I guess, messages are probably not going to be overly new to a lot of people, but as it relates to contractor management, we're hoping to share a few stories here to get people to understand different avenues out there to think about and how that might apply to their organisation. So, often there's a heavily reliant on compliance systems and rules, talk around legal requirements and all that sort of fun stuff, versus really trying to empower effective, high-performing cultures, talking around, effective behaviours, demonstrating care and concern for people, and making people feel comfortable to operate in an effective way. So often they're at loggerheads, these two concepts. So, some of the things that we help organisations with, and we'll share some of the results today to help people understand, is going beyond basic compliance and systems to really drive effective leadership behaviours. That can be done in a range of different ways. I know, Laura, that when we work with your senior management, the two Matts, they're heavily involved in a lot of the messaging around how safety is managed. And what we do find is when organisations start to move along beyond basic compliance and just looking at, getting people across the line around basic pre-qualification and starting engaging with contractors in a collaborative way, well, that's when we start to see generally better results. Laura, I know that there's a couple of clients that we speak about on a regular basis that you don't need to name names, but, do you want to share some of the challenges that you might have around some organisations that just don't have the culture right?
Yeah, it's look, it's not uncommon. We come from a background, I suppose, where safety was tended to be swept under the rug, because if there was a workers' comp claim, it was often perceived as, we just don't do those things. And if you've lodged a claim, you're not going to get, so we don't want people who are going to say things to us out on site about safety. So it comes from the people that come from that era of having a bad reflection on what safety means in the workplace to perpetuating that, I think, on site still. So we have had one site quite a lot of pushback when it comes to discussing safety with a couple of our clients. One in particular will be just sort of going, okay, can we speed this up? Can we hurry this up? Are we done yet? Just trying to rush you out of it rather than actually go into deeper conversations about what benefit that we can have as a supplier towards managing not just their staff, not just our staff, but theirs as well. So we do have a couple of clients where they will just say, I haven't got time for this, no time for safety. You're going to have to come out at a different time, whereas we're trying to push the aspect, well, we need to understand this now, understanding it later is not going to help us. So I know we've had FEFO go out to one particular site for us in New South Wales, and it was quite an experience. We have had some incidents on site before, and even following that, it was more, they were sort of just standing over the top, I think, of Mark going, okay, look, can we wrap this up? We done here? We had enough? And it was basically, okay, a tick and flick exercise for them. So unfortunately, that culture certainly is still around there, which we're trying to obviously negate. But yeah, it's certainly something that we're working with at the moment, and it is getting better. But there are definitely a couple of clients out there who would rather just not talk about it, I think.
Yeah, and I think although there's some challenges, I guess, with labour hire organisations sometimes, I think Skout also work with some tier 1 mining companies who are really leading the way too. So, it's not all bad news, but certainly I think that there's lots to learn around driving effective leadership behaviours. So with that in mind, here are some leadership behaviour results from the Health and Safety Index benchmark results from 2021. And the reason I thought it would be worth sharing this, I actually only pulled out these results yesterday in preparation for the webinar. It's actually quite surprising, some of the things that I've identified for the first time. So out of the 4 aspects the Health and Safety Index measures, safety leadership questions are integrated within the performance metric from low through to high performance. And you can see the results there out of the leadership questions that have been pulled out. We can see there's a pretty big range from 51 through to 88%. And, as we start talking around compliance versus culture, it's interesting to see that the lowest scoring result, having visible senior managers having effective conversations on site versus adherence to rules and procedures, which is the highest result, I think resonates with some of the messaging that we're trying to talk about today, is that it's not a coincidence that building high performance cultures is actually quite challenging. So it's not to say that organisations are doing this bad all the time. Often it's some of the more challenging areas to get right, and presents huge opportunities for organisations, particularly as it relates to contractor management and setting clear messages with the broader workforce around what good looks like. As we sort of start to move through the implications of what that looks like, it might be worth for the callers on the line, send through some Q&A chats around their experiences on setting clear expectations and really mobilising contractors in an effective way. Often inductions is a key milestone for organisations as they start to mobilise contractors. It's certainly not the only way. We'll go through some typical checklists that we use in a second, in the back end of this presentation, to talk about some other process around mobilisation, but certainly keen to understand from people on the call today some of their experiences around leadership behaviours. In particular, given that we're talking around the mobilisation of contractors, setting expectations is a really key component of not only driving effective leadership behaviours, but also setting clear tone from the top as contractors start to commence work on site prior to beginning. From your perspective, Laura, what's your experience of some of the challenges around, having selected a contractor, an employee, and getting them ready? Are there some key things that Skout consider when they're trying to mobilise staff prior to work commencing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we bring it back to having an understanding of the site, which we can communicate to people, which often helps long run. But understanding what's on that site, we marry up with the medical questionnaires that we sort of, put people through as well. So first of all, we will obviously mobilise people to the point where they are Skout ready to go. Now, then we need to take into account a medical history of sorts. No one is ever not guaranteed a job because of their medical history. And what it will allow us to do is ascertain where they will fit on the best site. So it allows us to recruit better for the client and more safely for the candidate as well. So if, for example, we understand on site A that there is a 25 kilo weightlifting capacity required on a frequent basis. However, the person that we've put forward potentially has suggested on their medical questionnaire that they're only happy to lift 10 kilos on a frequent basis, on a daily basis. We need to then find out where that lies so that we can actually turn around and have those discussions out on site. We have come to the point before where we're often referred people. So we get a lot of people who are referred to us from site. And our hiring managers, when they come to us, will have the expectation that that particular person is actually going to go out to site, which is not always the case because often the risk outweighs the benefit for us having that on site, that particular person out on that particular site. So we will push back on that in certain ways. But if we were looking at mobilising people in regards to safety and their aspects, we also do an induction to Skout so that we know that they understand what their requirements are and who their employer is, as well as who they're contracting to and who to speak to, so that they have a basic understanding of safety, which when they go to site, they will then be inducted to. So we manage their work history, and to ensure that people are work ready, it doesn't just come down to medicals. So it will also come down to us doing due diligence in checking their work history. So making sure that the job we're putting them forward for, they've actually done previously and recently, so that when they do go out to site, you know, they're actually okay to do that. And also reference checking them on a recent reference against the job they're saying that they've been doing. So we understand that, yes, that person is fit for this role, has the experience to do this role and understands what's involved in this role. And then we talk to them around safety. And that's just getting people mobilised in the first.
So, Laura, as you start talking through some of those examples, last week we spoke about how far to go, particularly around the selection and engagement processes. It's probably worth calling out that labour hire is a little bit unique in that often they're directing their employees as opposed to contractors, and the amount of due diligence done for labour hire can be a bit different to contractors. Notwithstanding that, I know some organisations that also provide declaration forms for some of their contractors too, depending on the nature of the risk that's presented. In the Q&A chat, we've got a question from Bruce around the frequency of inspections and assurance activity for labour hire organisations, particularly for those that are long-standing labour hire clients. So I might answer that one for you, Laura. You know, we work with Skout on a bit of a schedule. We try and make that based on risk. So depending on the nature of the facility, you know, some of the Skout staff are out on oil platforms, tier 1 mining sites. We've got some major hazard facilities all the way through to schools and some lower risk areas. So we try and tailor the frequency and the nature of the assurance activity based on the risk. There's also another question here around, is there a difference between large organisations and smaller, medium-sized enterprises around culture? And do SMEs do culture better? So it's a pretty tough one to answer to generalise, but certainly I think that there's it's often a balance between large organisations having more resources generally and able to afford investment in this space versus, you know, just the sheer size and the ability to communicate and engage staff, and depending on the size of the organisation can also present some challenges. So you know, I've worked with some small mum and dad organisations that got some amazing cultures, and they operate on a pretty low budget, but I think it is pretty hard to make a generalisation of who's better. So there's another question here from Andrew. How do we get contractor referees who give us the most accurate summary of compliance versus performance? So I think Andrew, not quite sure whether we're talking around referees for individuals there or for organisations. From your experience, Laura, do you use reference checks when you're engaging both workers and organisations?
Look, to be perfectly honest with you, when it comes to engaging organisations, if they're external, we do a credit check reference and terms of business. When it comes to working with Ventia as a whole, we have a preferred supplier agreement. Taking on contractors, absolutely. If someone is referred to us or we have gone and sourced the candidate, we will absolutely reference every single one of those people, simply because at the end of the day, they're our employee, regardless of who's asked for them to come on. They're not the responsibility then of the client. Oh, my thing's moving. Sorry, going up and down. In regards to ensuring that we have the most accurate reference check on file, we utilise a system which will actually prompt the employee themselves or the candidate themselves to provide the most recent reference. The questions are tailored within that, and what it will do, it will summarise everything for us and let us know what the recent activity is with that person. So it will tell us whether or not their activity was 6 years ago, or it'll tell us whether or not it was 3 months ago. So we'll know from those reference checks what's accurate. And if we're not getting enough information, we just continue on to try and find the most reasonable reference. So most people that come through will certainly provide somebody who's quite recent, but yeah.
Okay, well, look, we should crack on, given that we've only got 30 minutes. So we might answer some questions a little bit later on the Q&A. So, Laura's spoken a little bit about labour hire and how they do go a step further from typical contractors because they've got that employer-employee relationship. Often there are challenges with labour hire when you've got multiple stakeholders involved. So having the host employer and the asset owner often working with multiple stakeholders presents lots of challenges. Laura, if you like, is there any specific safety challenges that you find difficult as it relates to having multiple stakeholders involved in these sorts of arrangements?
Generally, I mean, it's everybody gets caught up, right? So the general consensus is in labour hire is that they're your problem, not ours. When you're talking to like your host employer, and it's like, well, this is your employee. So you need to have those conversations. It's getting people to talk and change the aspect around, well, yes, absolutely. But we need to make sure that when, they're on your site, that the responsibility lays there. And it's changing that, the way people think around it. And it's a time thing. So everybody's like, I'm so busy. I've got no time to do this, or I've got no time to do that. So it's then trying to assist in changing the mindset to say, hey, this is a value add to you. And we're trying to provide you with some assistance here. I'm just, there's my quote to people is generally, we can't be too busy for safety. We do have a lot of incidents that come through and a lot of hazards, which is great because we then can manage those as they come through. It's mainly around the communication piece, I suppose, getting people to say they have enough time to talk.
So with that in mind, we'll sort of crack on in terms of work readiness. That communication piece, Laura, we speak about a lot in terms of trying to get some visibility of what's going on site as the labour hire employer when there are multiple stakeholders involved. As that relates to mobilisation, now depending on the level of control and influence and the risk that we spoke about last week, will often depend on the nature of mobilisation activity. So although some of the key messages today is really around trying to promote high performance culture and right-size that over focusing too much on process. We do provide organisations checklists, so to give them prompters on things to think about when they are mobilising contractors. So if anyone would like copies of some of those contractors, depending on the nature of the contracting arrangements, we've got different checklists for different styles of contractors. More than happy to provide some copies of those for those people that are interested. So You can see on the screen here just a quick snapshot. It's not an exhaustive list of some of the typical mobilisation activities that occur depending on the nature of the contract, the type of contractor, and the level of influence and control. Won't go through it in a lot of detail because we've only got 30 minutes. So we might open it up for Q&A in a second, Sarah, to allow everyone on the call to ask some more questions. In terms of further information, we do have information on our website. Feel free to jump on there and have a bit of a look. We've got some case studies around organisations identifying their contractor requirements, particularly around safety software configuration. We've also got some information on there around business process outsourcing, not too dissimilar to what we're doing with Skout around supporting organisations around how they manage contracting and various contracting activity. So given the time, Sarah, I'll open it up to Q&A and give people an opportunity to ask some more questions.
Well, a few questions are coming through the chat, and you've already answered some of those. He says, Julian says, what about when a contractor tradie is for a specific short-term job? I don't know if you've answered that one.
Yeah, so onboarding?
Might be worth Julian just clarifying the exact question around tradies, short-term tradies, noting that they are very different to labour hire, and that the level of rigour that you would do for a short-term tradie, particularly if they're a sole trader, would be very different to engaging a large organisation for a long-term contract.
Okay, so Andrew says the nominated referee is generally going to give a positive feedback. How can we go further?
Do you want me to go?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. I have been very surprised. In 15 years, I tend to find that people will not always give a favourable reference, even though they are on a reference check. So that's a good indicator. We also have assurances in the system that we use, which will tell us, because if it's a fraudulent reference check, so whether or not that's actually been completed by that person, to make, to have that buffer there. But we can also go digging. We can, depending on your level of suspicion, I suppose, it's about trusting your gut a lot of the time, and it's generally right, is that we will go to the candidate and say, hey, look, have you got anybody else from here? Somebody else who's not a colleague, somebody else who is more of a manager. And by having those conversations, we tend to find out a little bit more behind why those particular referees are there, and can get extra information. But it's about communication and talking to them. So
Laurie's also made a comment here around relying a little bit more on verbal reference checks as opposed to written ones. You tend to get a bit more information. I think it's...
Yeah, look, we can do. It depends on your consultant, to be perfectly honest with you, because there will be people who will go in and ask the bare minimum of questions, and there will be people that will go in and do a real in-depth one. So we tend to utilise both. The system that we use is quite in-depth and gives us great information, but again, it's not always the quickest way to go about doing things. And we, picking up the phone and talking to somebody is often a really good way to find out. But yes, there's two very different ways of going about it.
Laurie's also suggested here to look at social media to do checks. It's not a bad idea, actually. There's a fair bit of information you can find. Depending on how much information people share on their social media accounts, of course. Are there any other questions there we've missed, Sarah?
Yes, so a couple of new ones. Bruce asked, if you can't influence a client in the health and safety space, do you still provide them with your services?
I'm not sure if that's a question for myself or Laura. From a personal note, there have been clients that we've decided to walk away from doing work on because their values don't align with ours. I can't talk on behalf of Skout, but no doubt there's going to be challenges depending on the nature of the client and the work that they do.
We have an escalation process. So if we do complete a workplace safety assessment and ascertain that it's extreme level of risk, we will generally escalate that to Matt Berry, who is the MD of Skout, and allow him to make the decision on whether or not we walk away and what we can do. If it's completely difficult to engage with people, and we need to understand the risk associated and how we can manage that. So, no, yes, if the risk is extreme, we would walk away from that, because we don't need to be putting people in a position that is going to put them in any sort of danger, because we're not there. And we have that responsibility of not being on site all of the time to manage it more effectively from where we are.
Julian asked, what is the minimum requirement to get the short-term contractor on site safely? Would the swims be sufficient?
So it's a pretty tough question to generalise. I generally suggest at a bare minimum to look at insurances, safe work method statements, and some form of induction. Bare minimum.
Okay, so that's it for the questions now, and we all know every time I say that there's another one. I wish there is. It's just a thank you. So right, yeah, so that should be it. We're a bit more on time this week, Mark.
No worries, Sarah. Try to stick to that 30 minutes. We do have another request here from Paul for me to email some of those checklists, mobilisation checklists. So got that email address, Paul. Happy to send that through.
Right. Okay, so hopefully everyone can join us again next week. Thank you, Laura, for joining us today. I believe the slides will be coming out as well, Mark.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Yeah, if you can pop them over to me shortly. And yeah, thank you, Mark, as well. So that was great. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Laura.
Bye.
Bye.